Okay, here's our video on Judaism and the ancient Hebrews. You have a note sheet that was given to you in class that you can use to fill out as you watch the video, and this is meant for you to kind of use to review what you read in the article on the ancient Hebrews and to correspond with what we watched in class, that video on Judaism itself. Okay, so let's get started here. So when we're talking about the ancient Hebrews, right, we're talking about kind of their homeland here in Canaan. And as you'll see in the next few slides, right, they'll have some interactions with both of our main civilizations that we've been talking about, Mesopotamia and Egypt. Okay, so most of what we know about the ancient Hebrews come in a sacred text known as the Tanakh, which is what Christians would consider the Old Testament. And the most important part of that are the first 5 books, known as the Torah. And so this is where we'll kind of discuss what is religious history known through people of faith, and what then can historians feel that they can prove through evidence left behind. So we also have another sacred text for Jews, which is called the Talmud. And this is a written record collected over the centuries that offer interpretations and explanations of the law found in the Torah. And for example, when Jews start to wander in the desert, or when they have to leave Jerusalem or are kicked out by the Romans, how do you still live your faith when you don't have when you're not in your homeland of Jerusalem or home city? So the Talmud then helps you live that law. So these are the sacred texts of Judaism. Remember, we've talked about kind of the unique contribution the Hebrews make here to history and to religion is monotheism, right? And so this will set them apart from the many civilizations around them. And so they believed they were protected by a God known as Yahweh. And they proclaimed that maybe there are other gods, but there's only one true God. And he was the God of people everywhere. And something that was also perhaps a bit unique was this idea that he was not a physical being and that there were no images made of him. So Israelites also could have a personal relationship with Yahweh, with the one true God. So this is kind of a little side note. So some historians believe that maybe the early Israelites were polytheistic and that Yahweh was the chief God. When they are captured by the Babylonians, which we'll talk a little bit later on in the video, they became more monotheistic. And so this is what kind of makes them different from their neighbors, that God is above or of nature, he's not in nature, right? So we said the Mesopotamian gods were in natural forces, but Yahweh is transcendent or above that. In conjunction with monotheism, another unique attribute of Judaism is this idea of prophets, right? So we learn in the Torah that God chose Abraham, the father of the Hebrew people. And so here he is from Mesopotamia. And in Genesis, in the first book of the Torah, we learn that Yahweh, or God, will make Abraham a father of great nations. And so then this is one of the founding principles of Judaism, and a contribution to both Christianity and Islam, the role of a prophet or a spokesperson for God. So at different times in Jewish history, the ancient Hebrews will wander. Abraham and his family will move to Canaan from Mesopotamia. Eventually his descendants will go into Egypt, and then they'll, of course, have some more periods of wandering. Now, your article tells us that, written by Spielvogel, says that this is sometimes what historians dispute. So the next few slides are what the Torah talks about, but say archaeologists and historians can't find evidence per se of this. So this is why I have the little star. So According to the Torah, the Hebrews had to leave Canaan because of a drought, and at first everything was great, but after being there a couple hundred years, they were eventually forced into slavery. And so we know this about Egyptian civilization, that slaves helped build some of these great monuments, and then the Hebrews were perhaps one of these groups of slaves. So at some point, historians guess, perhaps maybe 1300 to 1200 BCE, the Hebrews, the condition of their life in Egypt was so bad that they had to leave. And so the man who would lead the Hebrews out of slavery was known as Moses. Um, and so this is an important event for Jews, and they will commemorate the different aspects of captivity and escape through their holy days. And probably the most well known, and the one that the video we saw in class talked about, was the Passover. Moses then is a figure where he grew up as an Egyptian, right? That his mother put him in a basket to save his life, and he was found by an Egyptian princess. So he was raised as an Egyptian, not knowing his heritage. This is a famous sculpture by Michelangelo from the Renaissance. Um, so when, again, notice the star, so this is our religious history. So when the Hebrews were led out of Egypt by Moses, they crossed the Sinai Peninsula, which you know from your maps, and Moses went up to the mountain to pray. And the result of this prayer are 2 stone tablets, and they will now become known as the 10 Commandments. And so the 10 Commandments will be the basis for this new covenant, right? A new promise between God and the Hebrew people. So if you obey Yahweh, you'll have a promised land, and you'll have Yahweh's special protection. And that's what the experiences in Egypt taught the Hebrews, and why Jews then commemorate those events every year. Okay, so it took them some time, 40 years, to make it back into Canaan. And so here's some possible journeys that they went on. And so eventually they'll leave this nomadic lifestyle behind and enter into a settled society when they enter back into Canaan. So they organize themselves into 12 tribes, and this is a map. Each tribe um, got a certain portion of their land. And so when they kind of did their own thing, but in times of crisis, they would unite to deal with different threats. Another great contribution of the ancient Hebrews was the Hebrew law. And so from the Torah, we learn that God chose judges. One of them was a woman, and who played an unusual role in Hebrew society. In general, women were given the duty to raise children. And so the 10 Commandments were somewhat like Hammurabi's code, right? You know, an eye for an eye. So, as I mentioned, the laws were interpreted by religious teachers called prophets, and these were spokespeople for God. And we see some kind of interesting things here. This is why we say it's one of the great legacies of the ancient Hebrews. So they were urged to do these things. This becomes known as ethical monotheism. And this was really important. I think this is then the lasting heritage, both for Christians and Muslims, right? And then the civilizations that will come out of those religions. And they also had some dietary restrictions known as kosher. You know, how do they live in wandering in the desert and keep healthy and clean? Okay, so now we get to the realm of history. These are in records, historical records, and can be, if you will, proved by historians or archaeologists. So, because we find corroborating evidence that these men existed. So, from 1020 to 922 BCE, the Hebrews were united under 3 kings. And this new kingdom that was united was known as Israel. And so here are our 3 kings. So the kingdom of Israel, here you see it here, and here's Jerusalem, would fight with various other people around that area to expand their territory, including the Philistines. And eventually, the only large tribe left out of the 12 was the tribe of Judah. And so, because of that, the Hebrews will become known as Jews, right? And the religion Judaism. So, our first king is Saul. And so, I started to use famous paintings because, again, a lot of Western culture, and by Western I mean European and American culture, is based, Judaism speaks to that. And so you see these great artists throughout history kind of painting these famous scenes from the Bible. So here is our um, information here about Saul. And this is then David playing the harp. And so David was favored by Saul, but then eventually Saul will turn on David through jealousy, that David was then chosen by God and Saul lost his favor. So David then becomes king, right? He's the son-in-law of Saul, and he was very popular. He united the tribes, he made the city of Jerusalem his capital, and founded a dynasty. And here is another famous painting of David, kind of as a poet. But David will sort of make a mistake with this young woman by the name of Bathsheba, meaning she was married and he was married, but he fell in love with her and wanted her as his wife anyway. And they had a son, Solomon, who will then take over as the king. And Solomon was probably the most powerful of the king, right? And so he built up a trading empire. He was known for being wise. This is a famous painting of one of the famous moments of Solomon, right? Judging on which woman was the rightful mother of this upside down baby. Okay, and one of the great achievements of Solomon was building a temple. And so the temple became a permanent home for some of these most sacred objects from Egypt, one of them including the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the Ten Commandments. And it was richly decorated and super fancy, one of the great buildings of this time period in Canaan. And so this is kind of a floor plan, so there was different levels, and only a few people could enter into the most sacred spot of the temple. Here are some artistic renderings of what it might have looked like based on the descriptions. So you could see it was going to be, you can see the evidence of the wealth of Solomon's kingdom here. And these are the various rituals of early Judaism. Where is this temple? Well, if you know your Bible history, it will be destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE, which we will discuss later. Okay, so as we see throughout history, buildings like this require high taxes, and so eventually people think maybe Solomon's losing the true purpose of king and maybe getting too caught up in the wealth, and so people start to get unhappy. And so after Solomon's death, the Jews in the northern kingdom revolt, and so we talk about then a divided kingdom. Israel in the north and Judah in the south. And this is 922 BCE. And these will then be ruled by, I believe, Solomon's two sons will also then be part of this division. So, after this time period, the kingdoms will sometimes fight each other, sometimes unite, but then the Assyrians will come in and remember we talked about how they like to grab up people and spread them around. And so Judah that's why we say Judah was the only tribe really left, because the other tribes were being captured by Assyrians. And then the most famous of their captivity was under the Neo-Babylonians, right, and our friend Nebuchadnezzar. And so it will be the Persians, which we'll discuss later, who will let the Jews return to Jerusalem. And so thus ends our story for now of the ancient Hebrews, and we'll pick their story up a little bit later under the Romans.